Welcome, everyone. This is Trine Day's Roundtable number 11, JFK's Dream for World Peace. Nonviolence is not for cowards, with our host, Chris Milligan of Trine Day, and featuring husband and wife co-authors Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. I am Bruce DeTorres, and I moderate these roundtables. These were inspired by The Valediction, Paul and Liz's two-book novelized memoir about being the first American journalists allowed to return to Afghanistan in 1981 after the Soviet Union invaded in 1979. When Paul and Liz returned to the States, corporate media didn't want to broadcast the truths that they had found over there. And then Paul and Liz began a journey into history and mysticism, which they discovered is the real power behind empires. After Paul and Liz present, we'll open it up to everyone for participation. But first, our host, Chris Milligan.
Howdy, folks. I'm going to just share my screen here.
In regards to Iraq and also North Korea, I'd just like to quote you from President John F. Kennedy. And this was back at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when people were actually pointing real missiles at the United States. Now, if there was ever an excuse for us to threaten war with somebody, that would have been it. Today, what have they found? A few empty artillery shells and some, President Kennedy said, the United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We want to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We labor on, not toward a strategy of annihilation, but toward a strategy of peace. Think about that, folks. How far have we come?
One thing that I really enjoy is true history and a peaceful world. Wouldn't that be nice?
We are delighted to be here, and we're delighted to see you. This is our 11th roundtable, and we're hoping that we're building our case that we really do need to create world peace, and that this particular focus is about what we feel is uniquely special about John Fitzgerald Kennedy's contribution to these ideas. But before we begin our presentation, I'd like to make an announcement. World peace, as we have been talking about, is the only antidote that can neutralize the neocons' nihilist agenda before it forms into an apocalypse. But the right and left dialectic being used by the neocons keeps trapping Americans in a fight with each other rather than bonding together to make world peace a reality. As we continue to witness America's public discourse turning nastier, we decided to create an etiquette protocol to keep our discussions focused on what we have come together to do. Titled The Roundtable Sanctuary Rule, it goes like this. Until the plans for our world peace movement are ready to be set in motion, all issues unrelated to our progress moving forward will be dealt with another day. And now Paul will present what you need to know about Badshah Khan and his Afghan nonviolence movement and why it's not for cowards.
If anyone today could name an historical figure connected to the origin of nonviolent resistance against political oppression, it would most likely be India's Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi virtually defined the idea of nonviolent resistance in his struggle to free India from British colonial rule. But in 1929, a Pashtun tribal leader in nearby Afghanistan named Badshah Khan, a peer of Gandhi, became an important ally by inaugurating Afghanistan's indigenous nonviolent movement known as the Khudai Khidmatgar, servants of God. Since Khan realized that God needed no service, he decided that by serving God, they would in fact be serving humanity and set out to remove violence from their ancient Pashtun tribal code. Known as Pashtun Wali, Afghans had lived by the code's elaborate rules for millennia and continue to order their lives by it to this day. In addition to establishing a leadership council accepted by the community, Pashtunwali laid out in detail the proper behavior for hospitality, as well as what was necessary to create security for all, including how and when the act of revenge was acceptable. Following Britain's colonization of Afghan tribal lands east of the Hindu Kush, in 1848, these principles of Pashtun law were gradually replaced by new British colonial order. Pashtun society was already known to be in need of social reform for its long-standing acceptance of revenge killing. But the British creation of a small elite landlord class to control and administer the province turned revenge killings into a permanent bloodbath. According to Dr. Shruti Bala of the University of Amsterdam, quote, with traditional tribal authority diminished, this ruling elite gradually emerged as a group of powerful landlords who fought among each other and increased rivalry among the clans. By introducing their own manner of punishment and control, including fines, levies, and even imprisonment, they created a new culture of conflict with its own rules of settlement. According to Bala, this was a major change in comparison with the tribal council's traditional focus on limiting conflicts and blame and resolving feuds without punishment. The 1872 Frontier Crimes Regulation Act further worsened the situation by sanctioning punishments and mass arrests without trial and legal support, and placed heavy restrictions on the free assembly of ethnic Pashtuns. The Frontier Crimes Regulations were far stricter in the Pashtun territories than in any other part of British India, and directly limited civil liberties. According to Bala, quote, the infringements on civil as well as basic human rights were legitimized by the apparent need to control the Western frontier as a defensive line against Russian aggression and military advances in the region. And this was, of course, long before the threat of Soviet communism ever existed. British competition with Russia for control of Central Asia was a central feature of the 19th century imperialism known as the Great Game. Over time, a delicate balance was reached and Afghanistan used as a buffer state between empires, but not without a brutal suppression of the Pashtun tribes by the British. Khan's appeal to nonviolence was accepted by many Pashtuns as a way to resolve these deep-rooted social problems while undermining British authority at the same time. Although organized like an army, his recruits swore an oath to renounce violence and to never so much as touch a weapon. Over time, the Khudai Khidmatgar movement developed an educational network to address the social and cultural reforms needed to leave revenge and retribution behind and move towards nonviolent development. This network served the community by focusing on education for all, encouraging poetry, music, and literature as avenues of expression that would help eradicate the roots of violence that had become normalized among the Pashtuns during British rule. The nonviolence base of the Khudai Khidmatgar not only addressed the imbalance created by tribal feuds, it also brought Afghans under the single platform of nonviolence, which ultimately helped the Pashtuns present a powerful united front against British imperial designs. Abdul Ghaffar Khan was an active member of the Indian National Congress, chief of the Frontier Province chapter of the Congress, and a close ally of Gandhi. And when they first met, he questioned Gandhi about something that troubled him. Quote, "You have been preaching nonviolence in India for a long time," he said, "but I started teaching the Pashtuns nonviolence only a short time ago. Yet the Pashtuns seem to have grasped the idea of nonviolence much quicker and better than the Indians. How do you express that?" To which Gandhi replied, "Nonviolence is not for cowards. It is for the brave, for the courageous, and Pashtuns are brave and courageous. That is why the Pashtuns are able to remain nonviolent." Gandhi's response to Badshah Khan's question defined the Khudai Khidmatgar accurately, but a true understanding of the Pashtun nonviolence movement only begins there. The strength of Badshah Khan's Khudai Khidmatgar and its philosophy challenged more than just the Afghan tribal code of Pashtunwali and the dominance of the British Empire in India. Badshah Khan also challenged the idea expressed by many Western Orientalists that his movement was just an aberration. As we discovered in writing our book, Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, getting an authentic picture of Afghan culture through the minefield of Orientalist scholarship is no simple task. Sruti Bala's 2013 article in the Journal of Peace and Change points out that commentaries and studies of anything regarding the Afghan nonviolence movement are, quote, ridden with interconnected problems that make it impossible to come anywhere near an honest understanding of Badshah Khan's movement. Cultural stereotyping of Pashtuns, labeling acts of nonviolent resistance as simply an aberrant phase of an inherently violent culture, and denying the indigenous Afghan roots of the movement are just the start. Added to that is an intellectual prejudice which privileges elitist viewpoints of Gandhi's Hindu nonviolence movement over the actual concrete acts and practices of the Muslim Khudai Khidmatgar. The maltreatment of the Afghan nonviolent movement reveals more about the biases of Western academics than of the movement itself, and according to Sruti Bala, has completely obscured its place in history. She writes, quote, the social and political movement that this organization spearheaded is arguably one of the least known and most misunderstood examples of nonviolent action in the 20th century. The lack of extensive research is partly connected to the systematic destruction of crucial archival material during the colonial era, as well as by Pakistani authorities following independence. So why was the nonviolence movement of Mohandas Gandhi awarded recognition and international celebrity status by the West, while the Pashtun Khudai Khidmatgar movement and its leader, Badshah Khan, were suppressed, imprisoned, and eventually outlawed? Should the Afghan nonviolent movement be dismissed as just an aberration, as critics say? Or is it more likely that Badshah Khan's commitment by Pashtuns to internal tribal reform and genuine nonviolent resistance was something the British Empire feared might actually change the game, and so did everything in their power to erase it from the public's memory and pretend it never existed? Dr. Sruti Bala provides some clues about Badshah Khan and the suppression of the Khudai Khidmatgar. Quote, Abdul Ghaffar Khan belonged to a comparatively well-off landowning family. Unlike Gandhi or Nehru, he was neither a man of Western learning nor a prolific writer, she writes. In fact, he was described as a man of very large silences, a nationalist leader whose life of 98 years, 1/3 of which was spent in jail, is steeped in myth and legend. Khan spent nearly 35 years of his life in prison for his political activities and involvement in civil disobedience actions. The British and later the government of Pakistan systematically destroyed most documents and material records of the movement by raiding homes and confiscating anything related to the Khudai Khidmatgar, from handkerchiefs to uniforms and flags to copies of the movement's journal. The treatment of Badshah Khan was an extreme example of British colonial brutality that left a mark on Afghan society that remains to this day. But as Sruti Bala points out, without taking these aspects of Pashtun history into consideration, it's easy to fall into the Orientalist discourse of viewing Pashtun culture stereotypically as one that intrinsically values brutality and revenge. According to Bala, Indian nationalism also played an important role in perpetuating the image of the brute Pashtun, while never acknowledging or mentioning its own role in sustaining a racist Pashtun narrative. As an example, the Indian bourgeoisie were quite prepared to participate in the structural and institutional violence of the frontier province and eager to gain favors from the British. And then there is the Pashtuns' own complicity with the narrative through their service to the empire. Quote, the British ruled the Pashtun provinces through rich and influential landlords, Bala writes. One of the most prestigious regiments in the British Indian Army, founded in 1847, was the Corps of Guides, with a significant Pashtun presence. Many of the activities of the Khudai Khidmatgar were thus addressed as much against Pashtun collaboration with the British as directly against British colonial laws. Yet, without exception, the old stereotype continues to rule. Every historical account of the Khudai Khidmatgar always begins by highlighting Pashtun culture as violent and vengeful, instead of portraying it as a culture living on the borders between civilizations under constant threat to its survival and forced to defend itself. Why is this so? Again, according to Bala, Gandhi's speeches to the Pashtuns on his visits to Khudai Khidmatgar camps reveal a clear mistrust of Pashtun nonviolence, which can be traced back to both the suspicion of the lower class Khidmatgar soldiers' inability to embrace the high ideals of nonviolence, as well as a subtle anti-Muslim slant in his perception of the Pashtuns. So despite overt proof of Khudai Khidmatgar's commitment to nonviolence, Ghaffar Khan's movement continued to be subjected to Gandhi's personal mistrust of Muslim values, and specifically his class biases. Quote, for the Khudai Khidmatgar, Bala writes, nonviolence was not a matter of individual soul searching and achievement, but a principle for the entire community, requiring a collective effort. This is why I believe the Pashtun interpretation of nonviolence is very different from the individualistic approach that Gandhi adopted. And so in this is to be found a profound difference between the Afghan and the Indian concept of nonviolence, and perhaps the key to their success or failure as peace movements. According to Bala, Khan is generally placed in the shadow of Gandhi, often referred to as his pupil, or even more patronizingly, as the frontier Gandhi. They were good friends, shared similar views on civil disobedience, spent significant time working together, and held each other in high regard. But in terms of serving as a movement whose ideals for peace could be made universal, it would seem that it was Gandhi's appeal to the West's upper-class elites that won him success, even though Badshah Khan would have served as a more realistic grassroots hero for a world in dire need of workable community-based formulas for peace. Yet largely because of Gandhi, Badshah Khan's movement remains viewed as just a poor provincial attempt at replicating his ideology, and not a genuine indigenous movement of his own, and with its own characteristics. During his visits to the service and training camps of the Khudai Khidmatgar, Gandhi insisted on incorporating his personal ideas, such as vegetarianism, fasting, and hand spinning, the kadi, into their own social reform activities in order to instill what he believed was a true sense of nonviolence in the soldiers of the Khudai Khidmatgar. But for Gandhi to make his specific personal religious preferences a gauge for the purity of Pashtun nonviolence, he risked removing his philosophy from the realm of a cultural movement and placing it firmly into the realm of a personality cult. According to Bala, references in Khan's biography indicate that such missionary attempts at making Pashtun practices palatable to the liberal upper caste Hindu sensibilities were often met with mild derision. One Khudai Khidmatgar leader remarked that he had no objections to eating vegetarian food in Gandhi's ashrams, but wished the Gandhians would not be so fussy when they came to the frontier province themselves. Yet, as Gandhi's moral superiority was no laughing matter when it came to the plight of the Pashtuns under British rule. In an October 1938 speech to the Khudai Khidmatgar rank and file members, Gandhi announced openly that the Pashtuns' commitment to peace was incomplete. He then proceeded to refer the idea that Pashtuns who held life so cheap and would have killed a human being with no more thought than they would kill a sheep or a hen could at the biting of one man lay down their arms and accept nonviolence as a fairy tale. Gandhi made his apartness from the Afghan man and woman, landed or landless, a hallmark of his speeches. Reading them today betrays a sensibility and a disregard and prejudice for the detail, history, and context of Pashtun life that has been systematically carried forward into numerous current, high-minded, but failed social experiments. Gandhi's disrespect for the elaborate system of Pashtun tribal rules known as Pashtunwali is troublesome. More troublesome still is that multiple generations of historians and journalists have looked to Gandhi's Pashtun stereotypes as the end-all and be-all to the history of the Khudai Khidmatgar. Badshah Khan understood more than anyone the need to disassemble and delegitimize the acceptance of violence within the context of Afghan society as a prerequisite for creating an authentic peace movement. It is that model, inspired by Badshah Khan, that should comprise the next stage of a global movement that removes the impetus from the elites and places it in the hands of the people. And only by doing that can a genuine peace movement move forward. Liz?
Thank you, Paul, for the setup for what I'm going to deliver, because we're going to be now making the connection to John Fitzgerald Kennedy's attempt to bring this kind of inspiration to the American people. And we saw an alignment that we found in our research that Badshah Khan's nonviolent movement, we discovered that his foundational idea that Paul just gave you is very similar to JFK's American University speech. As you just learned, rather than focusing on British oppression as the first step towards nonviolence, Khan chose to reform the ancient Pashtun tribal code that sanctioned killing to resolve family feuds. It happens that JFK promoted a similar idea in what became known as the peace speech. Kennedy asked Americans to first reflect and reform their own concepts of peaceful coexistence before expecting the quote enemy to change. The path that led to the creation of that speech began with JFK's major reason for running for president in the first place. He feared that a nuclear war could still break out regardless of world leaders' best intentions. Within the first 6 months of his presidency, Kennedy's relationship with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had already started off badly on that very issue. His impression was formed during a meeting in Vienna regarding Laos, when Khrushchev was shockingly unresponsive to Kennedy's stated concerns about the human cost of a nuclear war. JFK's opinion changed when Khrushchev initiated a secret correspondence with him 3 months later in September that was kept hidden from the Kremlin due to the hardliners in Khrushchev's government. Kennedy would soon learn that the same problem with hardliners would overtake his own administration too. Khrushchev's first letter was 25 pages long and expressed his deep regret and that distrust interfered with their ability to develop a positive working relationship from the start. The premier compared their dilemma with Noah's Ark, where both the clean and the unclean found sanctuary regardless of who is clean and who is unclean. The message was clear to Kennedy: either we live in peace so that the ark continues to float, or we all sink. Kennedy sent a letter back agreeing with Khrushchev's metaphor, emphasizing, quote, whatever our differences, collaboration to keep the peace is more urgent than our collaboration to win the last World War. Thus began a very special relationship between two adversaries who are now becoming friends for the sake of world peace. The first test of their evolving relationship came by October of 1961, when a standoff between American and Soviet tanks at the Berlin Wall broke out. Before rushing to judgment, Khrushchev sensed it was brought about by elements in the US government without JFK's knowledge or approval. When Kennedy did become aware of the standoff, he utilized the already set up back channels to work out a withdrawal plan for Khrushchev. But the next test was far more challenging. There were times when Kennedy had to appease Cold War hawks around him, and one of those opportunities arose in March of 1961. Kennedy made this statement during an interview, quote, Khrushchev must not be certain that, where its vital interests are threatened, the US will never strike first. In some circumstances, we might have to take the initiative, end of quote. Khrushchev interpreted the last statement as a first strike threat, which resulted in the Soviet military alert. When Kennedy's press secretary tried to reassure Khrushchev 3 months later, he still was not convinced and began to review his military options in Cuba. It was then decided that placing missiles would not only deter an invasion of Cuba, it would fix the imbalance created by the US regarding its nuclear missiles in Turkey, where they were on the USSR's border. By October of 1962, Khrushchev's decision to place missiles in Cuba became a full-blown crisis that threatened a nuclear holocaust. During the darkest moments when the Soviet ships were approaching Cuba and nuclear war seemed imminent, Robert Kennedy summarized his brother's fear that the crisis would get out of control. Quote, what most haunted the president was the fact of all the children who had no say in what was happening and would have no chance to grow up and make something of our world. Transcripts reveal that the crisis, he was constantly being pressured to bomb and invade Cuba while catastrophic consequences were dismissed. Calls for a nuclear first strike on the Soviets continued, including one meeting where his advisors casually discussed the deaths of 130 million Soviets and 30 million Americans. But he was so committed to de-escalating, Kennedy withstood the pressure and refused to agree to any of these ill-conceived ideas. The crisis finally ended when Robert Kennedy visited Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin to deliver the president's message that his military advisors were pressing for escalation and things could quickly get out of control. And that's when Khrushchev ordered the Soviet ships to stop immediately in the water before breaching the US blockade. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles, thus ending the most terrifying standoff of all time. And Kennedy followed with a secret promise to remove the US missiles from Turkey. Those missiles were removed 6 months later. In December of 1962, journalist Norman Cousins asked Khrushchev how it felt to be so close to letting nuclear war break out, and his response was illuminating. I was frightened what could happen to my country or your country and all the other countries that would be devastated. But if being frightened meant that I helped avert such insanity, then I'm glad I was frightened. One of the problems today is that not enough people are sufficiently frightened by the damage of nuclear war. Despite progress being made between Kennedy and Khrushchev, they had reached an impasse on the nuclear test ban treaty. The Soviets feared inspections were an opportunity for espionage and agreed to 3. Kennedy realized that Congress would not approve a treaty with less than 8. The president sensed that the American people had drawn the same conclusion that he and Khrushchev had from the Cuban Missile Crisis. We need to turn toward peaceful coexistence, disarmament, and cooperation. Kennedy was becoming aware of the neocons in his government who would constantly undermine his peace policies. And in an effort to address that fact, he asked Theodore Sorensen to write a speech that would outline his vision for peaceful coexistence. And that became the basis for his American University speech, in which he explained that peace becomes far more accessible when it is broken down into manageable concrete steps, acknowledged the shared humanity of the Soviet people despite differences, and encouraged Americans to self-reflect on their own attitudes that could impede progress towards peace. On June 10th, 1963, President Kennedy delivered that speech that challenged Americans to think outside the box of war and peace and to empathize with the Soviets rather than just distrusting them. Kennedy had gotten the word ahead to the Soviets, and they allowed the speech to be heard all across the country. Suddenly, the outlook for the test ban treaty turned from hopeless to promising as Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to the principles of inspection by the International Atomic Energy Commission. This became the first nuclear treaty of the Cold War. Khrushchev then proposed that Kennedy consider a treaty banning nuclear testing in air, space, and water, eliminating the need for inspections, as well as a non-aggression pact between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Unfortunately, though, the speech was largely ignored in Washington. Ironically, one of JFK's goals when he went to Dallas that fateful day was to condemn the notion pushed by the neocons that peace was a sign of weakness. He believed that the best way to demonstrate American strength was by being a nation striving toward peace instead of aggressive actions. His greatest desire as president was to break the neocon ideology that had dominated Washington since the end of World War II. Now I'll read some passages from JFK's speech that highlight many ideas that we saw in Badshah Khan's writing that all emphasize a way to create a lasting peace. Quote, I have chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and truth too rarely perceived. And that is the most important topic on earth, peace. What kind of a peace do I mean? What kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life worth living, the kind that enables men and women to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. Some think it is useless to speak of peace until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitude, for our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitudes towards the possibility of peace, towards the Soviet Union, and toward freedom and the peace here at home. First, examine our attitudes towards peace itself. Too many think it is impossible, but that is a defeatist attitude. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. Our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we can do it again. Let us focus on an obtainable peace based on a gradual evolution in the human institutions, on a series of actions and effective agreements which are in the interest of all concerned. With such a peace, there will be conflicting interests, as there are within families and nations. But world peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. It requires only that they live together in mutual tolerance, submitting their disputes to a just settlement. So let us persevere, peace not be impracticable, and war not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help people see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. And second, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Soviet Union. It is discouraging to read a Soviet claim that, quote, there is a very real threat of a preventive war being unleashed by American imperialists against the Soviet Union, end of quote. It is sad to realize the extent of the gulf between us. But it is also a warning to the American people not to fall into the same trap as the Soviets, not to see only a distorted view of the other side, not to see conflict as inevitable, accommodation as impossible, and communication as nothing more than an exchange of threats. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. No nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. A third of the nation's territory, including nearly 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned to a wasteland. In short, both the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies, have a mutually deep interest in a genuine peace and in halting the arms race. Agreements to this end are in the interest of the Soviet Union as well as ours. So let's not be blind to our differences, but let us direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. For our most common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. We are all mortal. And that is the end of the passages from the speech. Like Badshah Khan, John Fitzgerald Kennedy knew that colonialism must end. In an exchange with India's Prime Minister Nehru, he explained that understanding was handed down from his own family's brutal 400-year experience with empire in Ireland as the first colony of the British. And that explains why both Khan and JFK connected to the same intuitive wisdom about creating an enduring world peace movement. It requires this commitment that we, the people, must give up the use of violence from within ourselves first. That is the end of our presentation, and we're very much looking forward to your comments and your thoughts.
Those words are just amazing. You know, they're just amazing. Do we know who wrote that speech?
Yeah, Theodore Sorensen. He's the one who actually crafted it for JFK. Yes. Yes.
And there was a lot of back and forth and quote unquote secret messages between Kennedy and Khrushchev too.
Oh yeah,
Right.
it went on for quite a long time. Oh yes, that could make for a
That's what they don't never tell you.
Yeah.
The back channel stuff is where, you know,
Right.
a lot of this stuff gets initiated and where it gets carried through.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I actually was quite surprised to realize that it clearly was the message that got through to Khrushchev that
Yeah.
they had to stop because they were going to do a
Yeah,
first strike,
yeah.
and Kennedy got the message through, you know, through his brother.
It's not quite accurate to say Sorensen wrote that speech because
Well,
they
he-
collaborated, you
Well,
know.
he crafted, he apparently asked him to set it up. I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't collaboration.
Sure, good. Okay. No, well, for those, you know, not as obsessed about Kennedy as I am.
Again, you know, we want to keep in mind here the larger concept that we're really working with. This is all in preparation for our attempt to create an actual, you know, world movement based on these ideas. But we feel by bringing in the indigenous power of Badshah Khan and the implication of that, okay, I mean, even the United Nations, as we know, has basically a special category for indigenous people. And we feel that the story we just gave you today about what happened to Badshah Khan as compared to Gandhi is a very good example of the reality of obviously what has happened to the indigenous world. And so this is an amazing opportunity to really bring forth not only the, you know, the reality of the power of Badshah Khan's peace movement, which is, by the way, still alive today. There is a website that, you know, it's got all of his work on it. It still has members. So this is still a living, breathing organization for the Afghan people and many others. But I think the important thing here is the opportunity to really shatter some of this thinking that has so blinded so many people in the West from, you know, the understanding of what it is to be on the other side, you know, of this kind of experience, especially coming out of the colonial experience, which obviously, you know, is what we're talking about with the British Empire in the 19th and 20th century, and the amount of devastation that still, you know, the impact that still.
And I don't think that most Americans understand that mentality. And I, you know, that may change soon, but the fact is that, you know, the United States still views itself with this exceptional view.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, that's become a barrier to getting to a genuine peace.
Right, right. Well, I think there's also this factor of the warmongers, the neocons. We've called them a number of names, but I do feel that the neocon name does seem to sort of represent this long history that we've seen in evolution. And our work goes back to, you know, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and how that was really created by the neocons, you know, and it became the casus belli for the last 40 years to drum up war. I mean, it allowed Ronald Reagan to actually create the largest defense budget since World War II, based on the Soviets being in Afghanistan. And what most Americans, of course, didn't know in the 1980s was that the Soviets they didn't really want to go in. When they actually got in, they were tricked in by Zbigniew Brzezinski's plot. And then once they got in, they would not allow them to leave because they kept the Mujahideen were given the weapons and the training from Pakistan. So they kept the insurrection going. And so there was a point at which the Soviets offered to bring back the king, okay, in order to try and resolve the problem in Afghanistan.
It was actually quite early on.
Yeah, and absolutely nothing. So this is clearly, I think, this is our opportunity, I think, in being able to raise the banner for not only our martyred president and, you know, really bringing the point home that this man may have been from a very wealthy family that obviously, you know, everybody views him as probably one of the elites because of that. But when you listen to his words and you really understand where he was coming from, he was not an elitist. Gandhi was more of an elitist than Kennedy was, that's for sure.
Yeah, and look at our history after John F. Kennedy was murdered.
Yeah.
Okay, the Vietnam War, and then war and war and war, and you know.
Yeah.
It's just right. We were very hopeful when Kennedy was president. Pete.
I'm an obsessive thinker, and I've done a lot of reading, and I don't know much. And I love the heck out of Chris Milligan. He is a true warrior, and a true warrior is not one who looks at violence in battle. A warrior as a samurai is somebody who is well versed in dance and poetry and origami and cooking and farming. So Chris, you're not my hero, but you're close. So what I want to do is remember a saying by Victor Hugo, that there's nothing so powerful in all the world as an idea whose time has come. And John Kennedy, as evinced by Douglas in JFK and the Unspeakable, and Douglas Horne in his magnificent book, JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, made it painfully clear that the perhaps suicidal John Kennedy thought that he could overpower the people who had brought us Operation Mockingbird, Operation Paperclip, overlooked Unit 731 in China, et cetera. It was a heroic and I think futile act. So if we all, I assume, are going to be successful in creating a paradigm, a context of peace, it's going to have to be that idea whose time has come, person to person, rather than trying to get the majority and use the all too prevalent paradigm of winning. A non-zero sum game is the only way that this can succeed. I'm in it, you know, all the way, but I feel like an ant crawling up an elephant's leg with rape on its mind. I'm done.
Well, I do want to mention to anyone who hasn't been participating in previous roundtables, we have been laying out a staging of many different aspects to this peace movement, because not only are we dealing with JFK and his speech, we're also dealing with the legacy of the Fitzgerald family going back to Ireland. And we're connecting some of the power represented by the speech he created and what he was really trying to do for the world and for the people as a kind of fulfillment for the legacy of the Fitzgerald family. And this is all part of the mythology that, you know, still exists today about, you know, the deliverance at the end of time, that there will be a kind of, you know, a resurrection of a very famous Fitzgerald called Giroidiarla, who was the Fitzgerald that always arose to help the Fitzgeralds when they were fighting against the British or the English at the time. And this eventually is part of the mythology that we really want to include to really help people grasp, I think, that there's a long legacy that we are trying to, you know, resolve. I think that it's a far more complicated situation than it might appear at this stage, that we're really trying to separate out some of the components about the motivations. For instance, that JFK was not just assassinated because he was trying to stop the war, you know, the war machine from going on, but there are also, you know, 700-800-year legacy issues that go back to, you know, the murder of Jacques de Molay and the Knights Templars and the hatred of the, you know, of Rome, and the belief. In fact, in 2016, we wrote an article about this subject, and we recommended the end of the revenge and retribution cycle that we felt justified the killing of JFK by this kind of thinking. And we got a notice from one of these people in 2016 who announced that not only, you know, was he a heretic, but he was very proud of the fact that they killed him. And he made it very clear that he did deserve to die for what they did to Jacques de Molay and what Rome has done. And this country was created by people who were, you know, protecting themselves against Rome. So this is part of the reality that we have to understand is still living today. And this is carrying on this endless revenge and retribution cycle. And we've got to be very creative in how we can really end this cycle without blowing ourselves up at the same time.
You well explained how Badshah Khan's movement has been marginalized, if not erased, Paul. I just wonder today, how well known is he in Afghanistan? Is he like a Martin Luther King Jr. to the Afghans?
I would say so.
Yeah.
Yeah. When he died in 1989, I think it was, Paul?
Yeah.
Something
Yeah.
like that.
Actually,
Apparently, he wanted to be buried in Jalalabad. And of course, it was during the Soviet occupation. And an awful lot of people had to do an awful lot of things to make it possible, because he was in the frontier area. This was in the Pakistan side, for that to happen. And it all happened because respect. In fact, if you go online now, you can find all kinds of videos and all kinds of people talking about the impact that he still has, and the way in which he's still an inspiration. And that's why we feel that it's particularly important, especially because of our work. We've been holding a terrible feeling of sadness for the Afghan people when we finally realized by the end of the 1980s that there was no way they were ever going to get their country back. It was already gone. We knew it. And we worked with Afghans for decades, trying to help them to formulate better communications, to ask for the right things, and to try to help them in whatever way we could. And when we finally met this one Afghan, Seema Wali, who was, she was actually the first refugee to come to this country in 1978. Her family was part of the royal family. And, she was actually, I think she came here sponsored by Ambassador Theodore Elliott. And we met her in 1998 after, we had obviously done our work in Afghanistan. And when we met her, the first question she said, "It's been 10 years since the Soviets left. Why is it still so terrible?" And we had to, oh God, Seema. And we had to sit her down and say, because they've never intended. And she's saying, but America's wonderful. And they were saving us. The Soviets were the ones who did. And we said, there's a whole different way this thing happened. You have no idea. We feel that by connecting to Badshah Khan and drawing the natural alliance that JFK really had with him, because when you look at what they both focused on to try to communicate to the people about how to become warriors for peace instead of warriors for war, it was very similar.
Well, I think one of the biggest turning points in recent history, and as a 75-year-old recent is different than with some, but ping pong diplomacy, when we exchanged athletic teams with China and did sports, I think that did more to break down a historic ill will between two combative governments than I can think of nothing else. And to look at today's Democratic Party leadership, and they shouldn't bring politics directly into it, but if we look at Kennedy's peace speech and we look at the saber rattling that's going on today, why don't we send a water polo team to Russia? Why don't we send a freaking quilting bee cadre over to Kosovo? We talk peace, but we wage war, and it drives me nuts.
Well, I think what I'd like—
Do you wage war, or does our country wage war?
True.
Exactly. Who is we? As the Firesign Theater once said, who am I anyway?
Time when JFK was killed. And, and I've got a couple other positives. I mean, the blood feud is an old thing. People have been trying to stop blood feud for a long time. The first novel written in Oregon called Bridge of the Gods, a main subset of it is about the blood feud. And then also there's some positives from history here. We've got a big fentanyl problem here, right? Now, where does that fentanyl mostly coming from? It's coming from China. Okay, well, at one point in time in history, the Western governments sent all kinds of opium into China, okay, causing them all kinds of problems. Okay, there is a thing called karma. Okay, and then also, when we started to support the fundamentalist Muslims, okay, to cause problems to the Russians, okay, and it's quite historical if you look at it. British intelligence started, using fundamentalism in the United States in the 1800s, okay, to affect our body politic. And I mean, don't you think that there's some sovereign countries out there that say, hey, you guys attacked us with fundamentalism? You think they might do the same to us and engender our fundamentalists into a big political brouhaha? So there's karma involved in all of this too. But it takes the people, we have to stand up. We have to do something at some point in time.
And after the response to Chris, I want to ask Marie to unmute and share. I see your hand up, but who has an immediate response to what Chris just shared?
I think let's go to Marie.
Right.
Right?
Okay.
Hi, thanks for the invitation. I came here by invitation of Marty Lewis. I'm Professor Marie Butcher at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. Thank you for your research and the connection that you all made between Badshah Khan and JFK. And I wanted to respond to Bruce's comment about the commitment to nonviolence and making it cultural and personal, and how I feel like that the movement, if we can just call it generally the peace initiative and the movement that has to occur right now, that it has to be like this groundswell and like this movement that engages people. And kind of bouncing off what Peter said, it's like it needs to be those people to people movements where there are the the water polo teams and the other groups showing that they are people too. I have the privilege of working with all international students, and so I can put a Ukrainian and a Russian together in the same room. I can put a Taiwanese and a mainland Chinese together in the same room. I can put and we can try and be people to people, instead of and then hopefully those people to people contexts then can go back to their countries, and then like it can help with these larger meta rifts societally. So I think the cultural movements are huge as far as like augmenting, as opposed to doing more on the cerebral level, and just like I'll say we intellectuals, like get kind of lost up here sometimes, and then it doesn't reach the masses. And I would, so I'm really curious about your initiative and your kind of strategies to make the peace initiative kind of bloom, blossom, flourish, reach more people. And before you answer, I'll have like one other little brief share, which was, I had the privilege of seeing Defense Secretary Perry on our campus many years ago. And he was asked in a forum, well, what was like the one thing that brought about the de-escalation and the nuclear arms race? Like, how did you do it? Like, what did you do? What did you do? And he said, it was the backdoor handshake. It was the diplomacy, the soft diplomacy. And I was just like, aha, it was just like that epiphany. Of course it was, it's the human to human contact that made all the difference.
Right. Well,
exactly.
de-escalating everything.
I mean, that was the experience we had when we brought Roger Fisher to Afghanistan.
Roger
And
Fisher
Roger
is-
had Roger Fisher for the Getting to Yes.
and well, he was the Harvard negotiation project.
He was the project.
Right. And his book Getting to Yes had just come out.
But he
actually,
said,
when we went.
he said at the time, he had done legal deals between the Soviet Union and the United States, and he had back channel communications. They asked Roger at the State Department to help out with the hostage negotiations in Iran prior to when we asked him. It was around the same time period that we asked him to go to Afghanistan with us. So he was perfectly suited to do this. And he met with his Russian friends. In fact, he was in the Soviet Union prior to going with us. And he was asked, somebody chased him around for a while until they finally found him. And they said, Roger, I want to talk to you. How do we get out of Afghanistan? This was in 1982. The Russians had only gone in January of 1981, in December 1979. So 1980 rather. So it was very near. Okay, and we eventually discovered that the Soviets hadn't wanted to go in at all, but they had been encouraged to go in. So how do you not only make the connections, the backdoor connections, the handshakes, the cultural transfers, and the knowledge of it, but you have to earn the trust of the other side before you can move forward with anything. And when you have an agency agencies, I don't mean any specific agency, I mean agencies who are working at the opposite of that. That is a practical problem. I said to Roger at one point, after he'd gone to Afghanistan, he came back from the embassy when he first arrived, and he said, I just spent the last 3 hours over at the Russian embassy, the Soviet embassy, and he said, they don't want to be here. It was a complete surprise to Roger because the prevailing wisdom in academia, the prevailing wisdom in government with the Americans that he'd been meeting with,
They don't want to leave.
they didn't want to leave. The assumption was that the Russians were there because there were a number of mantras that were
Yeah.
popular at the time about
Well,
what
they
the
were
Russians
going,
were actually
they were
doing.
actually the mainstream story, and this is, by the way, in our book in Valediction, 3 Nights of Desmond, where we lay out our media experience. We dealt with CBS, we dealt with ABC, we dealt with PBS, and numerous other media entities. And we got the bird's eye view of the manufacturing of the propaganda story on Afghanistan. And what we spent the next, decades doing eventually was finding out the real story and put that in Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story. But the point, I think, in terms of Roger actually knew firsthand, he said he knew that a deal could have been cut to get the Soviets out. He comes back to the Reagan administration and discovers there is no interest. And this is our problem, Marie, that we're not just, even when you get that moment with the back door, and Roger had many of those moments, but he was stunned when he got on Nightline and Ted Koppel basically set him up with the wrong people to give the wrong impression, and that was intentional. They basically set it up so that the American people would get the impression there was no point in following up on the Soviets wanting to get out of Afghanistan, and nobody did. Nobody. In fact, the New York Times said to Roger when he wanted to write an op-ed, he said, you can write it, Roger, but we won't necessarily publish it. So this is the reality that we encountered. So this is our problem as Americans, is realizing that, and what JFK revealed in spades was the kind of pressure because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he was literally being forced to drop a first strike on the Soviet Union and on Cuba. How he ever withstood that, I can't imagine, but thank God he did.
Well, Peter, 1 second. Let's hear what Marty has to share.
Yeah.
I want to thank you, Liz and Paul. I've just admired you for so many years, and it is time. Your word has come. It's time for it all to come out. People don't know me here, but really, I've worked in the media 50 years. I've worked in television, running big cameras and newspapers, magazines, chain of Walter Cronkite's papers. And I'm still in there, but I'm ready to go full time for peace, for sure. But right now, I've been doing think tanks since 2008, a lot for the DLI, that soldiers come over, and I have gone from 17 Arabic instructors up to 100 Arabic instructors who know who I am. So, but I had a business plan done at Ms., which is now Middlebury. And I will tell you now that Marie is the future here. So I'm so blessed to really wanting to work with her. She just took a sabbatical. And how many weeks?
I was 3 weeks in Costa Rica, and I was at the University of Peace, and am talking with people there. I'm working on a global leadership diploma, and I had an opportunity to speak with Ambassador Elaine White, ambassador to the UN from Costa Rica, and she's actually teaching a course at JFK on. So you might know her, Bruce, but she's teaching a course on negotiating for humanity. So I'm really interested in the pivot to looking at humanity in the greater context instead of the zero-sum game, instead of, like winners and losers, so I think the pivot is happening in academia, as it should, but it hopefully is happening in the negotiating room too.
So what I wanted to say, Liz, is I'm working with the Navy Postgraduate School, trying to bridge them with Marie and the DLI. So I gave the Navy Postgraduate School your book on Afghan Zero Point, since it was endorsed by the Navy. But I'd
Uh-huh,
like to
right.
I'd like to order or get a few more books because I'm gonna be going to the DLI. I want Marie to have something. And probably the Panetta Institute, because I started there. Because
Mhm.
Monterey, I can tell everybody, Monterey is not about food and wine. It's about intelligence. You got DLI, Panetta Institute, Navy Postgraduate School, and Middlebury Institute. It's all intelligence.
All of we JFK assassination researchers may not take into account that talking to young people today about JFK would be equivalent to us talking to each other about William Howard Taft, who was president 53 years before JFK was. The other thing that I know is Marshall McLuhan wrote a book called The Medium is the Message. And today's message is, unfortunately, Chris, books are powerful, but people want to be done unto by their cell phones. People want to be entertained. People want to be influenced. And at my age, I'm busting my tail right now to get into augmented reality, to buy the equipment and so on, because frickin' Facebook has changed over to Meta, and Klaus Schwab is telling us we won't own anything, but we will be happy. To me, that points directly to augmented reality and people walking around wearing headsets, pretending that they're someplace that they're not. I think we need to find some brilliant person who already is into augmented reality and produce something that will open the eyes of the young people and say, yeah, this is it.
Peter, I think that absolutely what we're trying to do is really counter the entire negativity process that people are trapped in. And that is what I read, my roundtable sanctuary rule. That is exactly why we thought we had to make that statement, that we want to keep making it, because we want people to feel a sense of sanctuary in having this discussion, because this is a feel-good discussion that everybody needs to connect to, that we really need this piece. And that's why when you read the words of Badshah Khan, when you read the words of JFK, you say, oh my God, they're saying those words. They're really talking about it. They're making it seem real and powerful, and I want it. So it's partly that, because people are being pulled apart basically on so many issues of contention and of polarization. And it's really the dialectic that people are getting trapped in. And this is really what the neocons are very well known for. Yeah. The neocons have been pulling the bureaucracy deeper and deeper into war for the last 100 years, okay, of whenever the first Trotskyist, I think this is really all considered to be the methodology of Trotsky, where you bring in basically a way to break people down and, and get them to fight each other.
Well, not only that, I mean, even, during the Great Game, I mean, you had the ultra conservatives in Britain egging on the ultra conservatives in the Russian court. So it went back and forth.
Right. We had that.
And the newspapers chimed in, and they would sell newspapers based on the fact that, oh, the Russians are doing this, so we have to do this. So they had a policy called the forward policy, meaning they couldn't sit idly by. They had to go forward and take over some more provinces in India or Afghanistan or wherever. So, we've been dealing with this problem in the results of this problem. But so what we've tried to do is try to get to the issue, and the dialectic, as Liz said, is a big part of it, because the dialectic is like, that's the machine, that's like the top. You start it spinning and it keeps going, and everybody says, oh yeah, I've got an issue with that, I've got a dog in that fight, so I'm going to join in on that. And so when you get it involved with 7 or 8 different tribal systems in various parts of the world, and I don't just mean tribes of ethnic people, I mean tribes of political tribes as well, you get chaos. And that's where we are right now. The top is spinning. As Yates said, the center will not hold, and it isn't holding. And I think we're seeing that right within the Biden administration. I think that I'm seeing all kinds of
right. Well, the idea that
I think Marie had something to say too. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I just wanted to respond to Peter's comment too, because I really think he's spot on about the messaging component. And again, since I have the privilege of working with young people, young, bright mind graduate students who are change makers, I have kind of a little bit of a more direct pulse of where their heads are. And when I ask them about the speeches that resonate with them, I mean, occasionally they'll go back to JFK. Sometimes it's JFK, MLK. It's the most recent, like Obama. Like Obama's like big on, articulate speakers. Whether I'm not talking about policy, I'm talking about just eloquence of speech and what resonates with the young people. And then what are the ways in which they like to communicate? They like to communicate through story. They like to communicate through narrative and story and personal story. I have a young man now, he's really brilliant young man from Egypt, and he's doing this whole initiative on peace stories. And so I want to connect him with, maybe you know the group Peace One Day. It was, if you don't, everybody should know it. I will put it in the chat. But Peace One Day is an initiative that was started by one young man at the time, Jeremy Gilley, who said we need one day of peace, right? And to have this ceasefire and like a declaration of peace that can be observed on one single day. And he pushed it through, one single guy. So like there is like the power of one that then goes to many.
Yeah.
Right.
And how then he's like built this whole platform. And I think by connecting, like Marty spoke of being dot connector. Well, I see like, and anybody involved in peace work needs to connect with other peace initiatives. And so this is one where the Peace One Day initiative, they have this huge platform. And so I intend to like kind of funnel some of the energy of my students there and say, look, here's this huge audience. And I'm just curious about your strategy as far as that messaging and how to reach people and then how to connect with other peace builders.
Well, that's actually what we've spent about the last 7 roundtables evolving. Okay, we have many different stages, as I mentioned. We're including the legacy of the Fitzgerald family in the process because we feel that that is an important component that most people don't even realize. There is a motivational level of leadership in this world that is very, very serious about what happened 1,000 years ago. And that's part of what we want people to open up to. We're not saying that that it's the end all and be all of everything, but you need to appreciate there are different motivational problems going on here, okay? And that we need to be aware, okay, of those different motivational levels. So what we're covering is a kind of a whole bunch of bases, which includes a personal component, because we feel, as you just said about, it's all really about the narrative, and ultimately it's about your own personal narrative. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Well, that is the question we asked ourselves in 1987 when we faced all the media, okay, the mainstream media, and we saw what was going on with the Afghanistan story, with the Soviet invasion, how it was being handled. And we realized, even though we dragged back all this proof of what we had, and it wasn't an issue that it wasn't true, that was not it. They just didn't want it because it didn't conform to the narrative that they wanted to put out. So in 1987, after 3 experiences with the networks, we finally said, why are we doing this? What's the point? What can we really do? And that's what we spent the next 20, 30 years evolving and coming to understand. This is about the narrative. And right now, we know that a lot of the narratives that are being put out by the mainstream have very little substance. I like to say, most narratives are not necessarily lies because you don't agree with them. They're just someone else's viewpoint. But when you build your narrative based on propaganda, that's lying.
Well,
and we've got a lot of a narrative right now, especially when it comes to the evolution of the Afghanistan crisis, that is all propaganda.
Well, I want to point out the fact that, when the Cuban Missile Crisis hit, I was a kid, and my 2 older brothers were called up. One was in the Marine Corps, the other one was in the National Guard. Everybody was involved in it. Everyone was conscious of what was going on. And they were conscious of it because the movies that were being made during that time period focused on it. That we had a number of movies that influenced my understanding of it, and probably carried through to the point where I was interested in going to Afghanistan and grabbing that story, because I was motivated by these things that were on the screen when I saw when I was 8, 9, and 10 years old, on the beach, the Bedford incident, the Dr. Strangelove. I mean, there were a number of really very interesting movies. Failsafe. I was fascinated by Failsafe, the idea of a pilot who had been trained to go and do this job, and something screws up along the way, which was inevitable eventually. It was just a mechanical failure, and they can't call him back, and he's going to start World War III. And he says, there's one thing where Frank Lovejoy says at one point, they get his wife on the radio, said, don't do this, don't do it. And he said, you're asking me to do something I was specifically trained not to do. So I have to shut you off. And he cuts her off. And that's the whole movie right there. You're dealing with a projection of an idea that's been moved forward in everyone's mind. So I would suggest that, as a start, we need the media on our side. We need the media flipped from being what they are, which is the warmongers, into being the peacemongers.
Right. Well, we got to turn the warriors from warriors for war into warriors for peace.
Exactly.
They're
And
still warriors.
Badshah Khan is a very good
Yeah,
example
yeah.
of that.
And part of the dynamic, really, I mean, the dynamic has been changing. Basically, the internet, okay? We haven't seen all the changes that the internet have wrought yet, okay? And so that is the dynamic that I see is allowing us to discuss the perfidy that's going on and creating strategies to take back our world from these warmongers and live in peace. Why not? Why not?
Absolutely. Peter?
Yeah, Chris, I totally agree. I think I'm in 98% agreement with everybody here. And I feel it's appropriate to mention that Mahatma Gandhi also had what was called the doctrine of the sword, which he stated that it was our duty to defend ourselves, even if it required violence. And so there was a certain point where our peaceful idealism can be subverted by total pacifism. And I'm obviously not extolling violence, but it can't be totally eliminated, or I think we'll just become a victim class.
Well, I agree with what you're saying.
Have you seen what happened in Iceland? I mean,
It depends
Iceland
on
is
when.
a small country and blah, 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 but they got 95% of the people out there on the streets, and they changed the government. Okay, it can be done.
Right.
It can be done.
I think the comment we started with about why Gandhi said to Badshah Khan that the Pashtuns are not cowards, because to really give up violence at that level, that's what he was talking about. And the reason the Pashtuns were ready is because they had been living in this violence for thousands of years. They truly were ready to say, no, I don't need it anymore. That would be what I'd say to you, Peter. So it's a matter of where you are in your getting rid of the need to use the violence.
Yeah.
But once you make that level of commitment, you can change people. You can actually change the way they interact with you. That's how you can protect yourself in a very different way.
It brings up in me the issue of personal integrity. And ringing in my head right now is give me liberty or give me death. I'm thinking of the courage of the young people in the South who sat at lunch counters knowing they were going to take a beating.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it's like to take a beating while I'm resolved not to defend myself. I'm going to be true to my ideals. I'm going to love my fellow human to the extent that even if they're hitting me with things, I'm not going to hit them back. And throughout all these roundtables, and specifically the development of a peace movement, this keeps resonating inside me. And I probably couldn't even imagine it if I was younger. But I'm at the age where I've lost so many loved ones who are older than me that I feel the pull and the allure of death. Like, wait a minute. if maybe they're all up there and it was good enough for them, I could imagine now at this age going into something like that. But to be of warrior age, like Bakhtiar Khan's troops and the young people in the South during the lunch counter sit-ins, I feel like this is a huge part of what will either create peace or not.
Well, as Peter said, he's dealing with this meta business. The most important meta part is right here, is between your ears. That's where the war really is. Yeah. And that you expressed it. You know, there are aspects of it. I mean, I grew up, I played football. I was also a singer. I was a performer, and I used to get picked on when I was 10, 11, 12 years old. So I had to learn to defend myself. I had to find that part of me. And, you know, I did not come from violence. I just simply said, look, if you're going to hit me, I'm going to hit you back. That was simple. But I never did it. I was never the aggressor in the situation. And I made that a part of my life. And the point is that I always believed that you can intellectualize it to a point where you can actually get the other people, win the crowd over.
Yeah, different ways
of doing it. Win the crowd to your side.
Right.
And you know, you can do it. It is doable. Okay. And the fact is, we are living right now under probably the most intense crunch in the last 500 years, maybe 1,000 years, in terms of overt propaganda that has been pushed us into a corner and said, come on, fight me. And that's why I think it's probably, this is we're being tested as human beings. Do we have the ability to overcome meta? Do we have the ability to sort these things out as human beings in our own mind and create a human society for ourselves, not a machine society? Machines were created by humans in order to serve humans, okay? I don't believe that we need to be the victim of that kind of mentality and the machine mentality. And believe me too, I recall when I was in 5th grade, I recall when the intellectual testing company came in and they tested everybody in the class. And I realized later that that was all part of a program in order to instill machine thinking. Now, Noam Chomsky endorsed our books that we did with City Lights back 10, 12 years ago. And I had not realized at the time that he was the creator of a lot of the machine thinking. He even told us, he said, you know, the Pentagon pays my salary. They've made my career here at MIT. And he said, I didn't realize at the time why they had made him so important. He was the guy who created the machine language. And that was put into our public schools and put into even some of our Catholic schools and private schools to teach children, young children, how to think like a machine. So think of meta as just an evolution of that machine thinking. We've come across, I mean, I've had automobiles that were more human than some of the humans that I've met who've been educated through this system. They never broke down on me in the middle of a traffic jam. They always got me through till I limped home with them, okay? So, I mean, the fact is that I think that we have to start separating ourselves from this machine thinking and thinking that it's inevitable, that AI is inevitable, as an example.
And that's why this is the reason that this is important, that this is for people to have something deeply positive to connect to contribute to. We have a lot of stages of this. We're putting it together in written form so that someone could look at the whole thing and get a sense of our ideas. But we want input because the way we two think isn't necessarily the perfection of what is needed for this thing to be pulled off.
Chris said something to say. Chris?
Love your enemy is not just a platitude. It is actually a strategy.
Right.
Sun Tzu, right?
Onward.
Onward.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.